I'm Jackie Knowles of Glassware Pixie, partnering with Oceanside Glass and Tile to bring you this instructional Fusing Fundamentals video series. Today we're picking up in Lesson 8, where I'll explain the purpose of slumping, draping, and casting, and I'll use the molds we prepared in the last lesson to demonstrate the different forms produced by each of these techniques. Slumping and draping are processes by which a flat piece that has already been kiln fired to a high temperature, say to a full fuse around 1460 degrees Fahrenheit, is then put on a mold and refired to a lower temperature, say to around 1230 degrees Fahrenheit, so that the piece heats just enough to conform to the mold shape. These techniques transform flat projects into things like dishes and bowls with interesting three-dimensional form. Since slumping and draping bring the glass only up to low temperatures where it won't fully tack, contour, or full fuse, it should be the last stage of a project. This means that in most cases, prior to this stage, you should have an already fused piece complete with any accessory glass accent. Changing its shape is the final finishing touch. Slumping and draping share a similar purpose, but there's a difference between the two. Slumping is when glass is heated over a concave form so that it drops into the form. Slumping is typically performed with ceramic molds because during firing, ceramic expands and contracts less than glass. This means that as glass cools, it can easily be lifted off of a concave ceramic mold underneath it because the mold has not contracted enough to hold the glass in place. These are just general guidelines, though. There are some molds made from non-ceramic material that are great for slumping, such as very shallow stainless steel bowls. Draping, on the other hand, is the process of heating glass over a convex form so that it falls onto and over the form. Draping is typically performed with stainless steel molds because, opposite to ceramic, steel expands and contracts more than glass when heated. This means that as glass cools, it can easily be lifted off of a convex steel mold underneath it because the steel has contracted enough to remain smaller than the glass. But again, these are just general guidelines. There are some molds made from non-metallic material that are great for draping, such as very gently curved ceramic shapes. To slump glass in a primed mold, position the mold in the center of the kiln, ideally a couple inches away from the heating elements. Elevating the mold on kiln posts or fire bricks will help promote even heating. This is especially necessary if the vent holes in the mold are directly blocked by the kiln floor. Then, position the glass in the center of the mold, being sure that none of its edges overhang the mold. Once it's positioned, the kiln can be started. To correctly position glass for draping, it must first be ensured that the mold is tall enough by confirming its total surface length. To do this, run a tape measure from the edge of the mold, up its side, across its bottom, and down its other side. The longest dimension of the glass should be about 1 inch less than this dimension, because as the glass drapes down around the mold, gravity will stretch it slightly. The glass can be longer than this, but if that's the case, be aware that the project's ends may touch the kiln shelf and flatten out. Note that since draping can significantly stretch and thin the glass, it's best to use a minimum of 2 layers of glass in a piece that will be draped to allow for this stretching to occur. Once the correctly sized mold is determined, position it in the center of the kiln a few inches away from the heating elements. Since draping molds tend to be taller than slumping molds, they can't always be elevated to the same degree, especially in small kilns like mine. If that's the case, elevate it just enough for air to escape from underneath. Then position the glass in the center of the mold so it drapes evenly instead of falling off to one side. Once the glass is positioned, the kiln can be started. The specific firing schedule used to slump or drape a project will vary depending on the project's size and thickness, the type of mold used, and the desired aesthetic. But as an example, A basic slumping or draping firing schedule for a 12-inch project made with 2 layers of Oceanside Compatible 3mm glass would consist of the following: a 2-segment initial heat and initial heat soak phase that ramps up at a rate of 250 degrees Fahrenheit per hour to 250 degrees Fahrenheit and holds for 15 minutes, and then ramps up further at a rate of 250 degrees per hour to 1050 degrees and holds for 30 minutes, a rapid heat and process soak phase that ramps up at a rate of 150 degrees per hour to 1225 degrees and holds for 10 minutes, a rapid cool and anneal soak phase that ramps down at a rate of 400 degrees per hour to 950 degrees and holds for 60 minutes, an anneal cool and anneal cool soak phase that ramps down at a rate of 200 degrees per hour to 800 degrees and holds for 10 minutes, and a room temperature cool phase that ramps down at a rate of 300 degrees per hour to 100 degrees with 0 hold time. When adjusting a firing schedule for a slumping or draping project, remember to consider the piece's overall thickness as discussed in Lesson 2, and allow for slow enough heating and cooling to avoid thermal shock and excessive anneal strain. If you're using Oceanside Compatible glass, you can reference Oceanside Glass and Tile's Refiring Thick Previously Fired Work document to assist with this. If after removing a slumped or draped piece from the kiln, you find that it hasn't conformed to the mold to the degree you want, you can refire it at an adjusted schedule with a higher process soak temperature, a longer process soak hold time, or even an increase in both. Be aware that certain glasses slump and drape faster or slower than others due to their viscosity. Glasses with high viscosity will require higher heat and longer holds to conform to a mold than ones with low viscosity. Generally, opalescent glasses have higher viscosity than transparents, with white being the highest viscosity color and black being the lowest. Projects made with a mix of transparencies and colors will likely need to be slumped and draped at a rate slow enough for the project's highest viscosity glass type to conform to the mold. By keeping careful track of all the firing schedules you use and the results, you'll be surprised at how quickly you develop a knack for determining just the right firing schedule for your projects. Casting is the process of melting glass into a mold so that it forms a solid object. Casting molds are similar to slumping molds in that they are usually made of ceramic, and the glass conforms into the mold. However, in casting, the glass fills up the entire space within the mold, as opposed to just being layered over it. Unlike slumping or draping molds that are used with pieces that have been previously fired, casting molds are typically used with frit or small pieces of scrap glass. In order for this glass to completely fill out a casting mold post-firing without shrinking significantly, the mold should be filled with an amount of frit equivalent to 2 layers of 3mm sheet glass, as per the 6mm rule we learned in Lesson 4. Because of this necessity, many casting molds will come with a recommended fill weight, allowing for the measuring and weighing of the exact amount of frit needed to fill it. But if you don't know the exact amount of frit required for a mold, you can calculate it yourself. First, place the mold on a scale and tare it. Then, carefully fill the mold with water up to the level you'd like the finished glass piece to fill, and record the weight in grams. Multiply this weight by 2.5, which is the specific gravity of glass, and the result will be the number of grams of frit needed to fill the mold. Weigh out this frit, and then pour or spoon it into the mold. Throughout this process, gently shake the mold or tap it against a work surface to ensure the frit is sitting evenly. After the mold is filled, use a small brush to collect any excess from the sides. Follow the same procedure as with slumping and draping molds to position the filled casting mold within the kiln by placing it in the kiln center, elevated by 1 to 2 inches. Once the mold is in place, the kiln can be started. Just like with slumping and draping, the specific firing schedule used for casting will vary depending on the project. But as an example, the firing schedule for a 2 by 2 inch mold filled with a 1/2 inch layer of Oceanside Compatible frit would consist of the following: a 2-segment initial heat and initial heat soak phase that ramps up at a rate of 100 degrees Fahrenheit per hour to 300 degrees Fahrenheit and holds for 15 minutes, and then ramps up further at a rate of 250 degrees per hour to 1050 degrees and holds for 10 minutes. A rapid heat and process soak phase that ramps up at a rate of 600 degrees per hour to 1500 degrees and holds for 10 minutes. A rapid cool and anneal soak phase that ramps down as fast as possible to 950 degrees and holds for 90 minutes. An anneal cool and anneal cool soak phase that ramps down at a rate of 100 degrees per hour to 800 degrees and holds for 10 minutes. And a room temperature cool phase that ramps down at a rate of 300 degrees per hour to 100 degrees with 0 hold time. As we learned in Lesson 2, projects made with thick layers of glass require longer annealing time to avoid thermal shock and excessive anneal strain. When casting thick projects that are a 1/2 inch or more using Oceanside Compatible glass, you can reference Oceanside Glass and Tile's Thick Firing Schedules document to modify your firing schedule accordingly. Lastly, when casting, be aware that using different frit grains will result in different aesthetics. Very fine grain frits will trap lots of air bubbles, giving the fired form a solid, cloudy appearance. Larger frit grains will result in higher clarity and less bubbles, but the bubbles that do show will be larger in size. This behavior can be leveraged to create a wide variety of different looks. Alright, if you've been watching the lessons of this series in order, then by this point you understand compatibility principles and how glass behaves when it's heated. You know how to construct a stable project using both sheet glass and accessory glass that will result in the specific aesthetic you want, and you know how to prep shelves and molds for use in a kiln programmed to various different firing schedules. This means you're more than ready to start creating your own fused glass pieces. Up next in Lesson 9, we'll combine all these skills to create a little project. I'm looking forward to working together!